The most dangerous thing about an oil shock is not the day the public finally notices it. It is the period before that. The period when the physical world has already changed, but the financial world is still pretending it is not. That is where we are now. And if you do not understand that sentence, the next part of this cycle is going to feel much more sudden than it actually is. Because what is coming is not really an oil story. Oil is only the front door. Behind that door sits transportation, fertilizer, food, inflation, bond yields, consumer confidence, corporate margins, and the strange modern habit of using paper markets to tell a calming story long after the real world plumbing has already stopped cooperating. That is why I want to begin in the only place that matters. Not with the stock market, not with what politicians are saying, not with what some optimistic economist hopes will happen if everybody keeps repeating the word ceasefire long enough. I want to begin with the physical world because the physical world has one quality I trust more than almost any spreadsheet ever made. Eventually, it humiliates people who try to negotiate with it through narrative. A refinery does not care what the White House is saying. A tanker does not care what a futures contract implied last Friday. A fertilizer plant does not care whether the stock market decided to rally on a rumor. A country that needs real oil in 10 days does not care what the paper price said on television if the actual barrel costs much more and the shipping route is still broken. That is the difference between a screen and reality, and right now that difference is growing. That is the story, not simply that oil may go higher. The much more serious story is that we may be watching one of the largest divergences in modern history between the paper price of energy and the real cost of obtaining it in the physical world. That is where danger starts, because once those two worlds separate, one of them is living on borrowed time. And history tells you very clearly which one eventually loses. Not the ships, not the barrels, not the fertilizer plants, not the trucks, not the households. The paper story loses. It always does. Now let me explain how we got here. On the surface, the market has been fed a simple tale. The Strait of Hormuz is open, then it is closed, then it is open again, then everything is under control. Then some official says the worst is behind us. Then crude falls a little. Then stocks rally. Then the public is told that the whole thing was exaggerated and America, as usual, will be fine. That is the stage play. The problem is that the real world has not been acting like a world where everything is fine. Ships have rerouted, flows have tightened, physical delivery has become far more expensive than the paper benchmark implies. Pipelines and energy infrastructure keep suffering accidents with suspiciously bad timing. Asia has already been hit. Africa has already been hit. Europe is bracing. And the United States, which likes telling itself that being a big producer means being immune, is about to discover that being a net user in a globally priced system is not the same thing as being safe. That is the first illusion I want to break. America is not magically outside the oil story just because it produces a lot of energy. It still imports crude, it still refines within a global system, it still relies on shipping, pricing, and logistics that are affected by the same bottlenecks hurting everyone else. And once you understand that, the phrase the world's gas stations starts sounding less like strength and more like propaganda for nervous people who would prefer not to read the math. The math is not complicated. America imports more crude oil than it exports. Not refined product stories, not broad energy branding, crude oil. That matters because crude is the raw feedstock that still has to move through the system if the domestic machine is going to run smoothly. So when somebody tells me America will be fine because it is an energy giant, I ask a very simple question. If we are so insulated, then why does the real world cost of physical barrels matter so much to our own downstream system? That is the question serious people ask. Now let us go one level deeper, because this is where the entire story becomes more dangerous than the public conversation allows. There are two oil prices right now, the one you see and the one the world pays. The one you see is paper Brent, the futures price, the screen number, the quote that travels through media because it is easy, clean, and psychologically useful. That is the number most people mean when they say oil is around $100. The one the world pays is physical oil, actual cargo, actual timing, actual shipment, actual urgency. The price attached to a real barrel moving to a real refinery in the real world where no one accepts the app said otherwise as a substitute for delivery, that price is much higher. The spread between paper Brent and dated Brent physical delivery has blown out to levels that are not normal, not healthy, and not remotely comforting. That is the tell. For nearly 2 decades, those two prices mostly move together. A little gap sometimes, a few dollars in a stressful period, maybe more when something unusual happened. Fine. That is how functioning markets behave. The paper claim and the physical barrel remain close enough that the futures market still looks like a real price. Discovery mechanism rather than a psychological management tool. But when the spread becomes enormous, when the paper price says one thing and the real world delivered cost says something much harsher, then the futures market is no longer simply reflecting reality. It is lagging it or hiding it, and either interpretation should make you deeply uncomfortable because a paper market that drifts too far from the physical truth is not harmless. It is a delay mechanism, a sedative, a temporary screen the public watches while the real cost structure underneath the economy is already changing. That is what I think is happening. Now, the people who need actual oil are paying up. The people staring at the screen are being shown a calmer story. That difference cannot last forever. And once it ends, the reprice does not only hit traders, it hits households. Now, let me explain why the timing matters so much. People assume that if an oil shock were real, they would already feel it at the gas station. That is not how these things work. Oil shocks travel. They do not teleport. The first phase is flow disruption. Then inventory buffers are drawn down. Then the cargoes that had already cleared before the disruption continue arriving for a while, creating the illusion that maybe the whole thing was overblown. Then those pre-shock barrels are used up. Then the replacement barrels arrive at the new, uglier economics. Then refiners feel it. Then distributors feel it. Then transportation feels it. Then consumers feel it. Then the media starts acting surprised. That is the order. Not because anyone is stupid, because this is how physical systems transmit pain. They have inertia. And inertia is politically convenient because it creates a short window where the public can be told that everything is fine while the underlying costs have already turned against them. That is exactly the window I think we are in. J.P. Morgan's timing framework, as described in the source material, points toward a very important threshold. The last pre-closure cargoes clear the system, the old buffer disappears, and suddenly there are no more cheap old barrels left in the supply chain to preserve the fiction that matters. Because once the buffer is gone, the paper price and the physical price have to stop living in separate moral universes. The paper side must either admit reality or collapse under it. That is why I am much less interested in whether oil looks calm today than in whether the physical inventory and shipping timelines still give the market room to pretend. Pretending time is a real asset in crises, and it is running out. Now let me show you the scale of the whole, because this is where people become serious. The world uses roughly 100 million barrels of oil a day. That is the machine. When you are missing 8 to 13 million barrels a day from that machine, you are not talking about some manageable little annoyance. You are talking about a supply gap large enough to matter even in a system with reserves, emergency adjustments, and rerouting attempts. People hear 8 to 13 million and their brains do something very unhelpful. They compress it, they treat it like a percentage, and then move on. Do not do that. Translate it. That is roughly half of America's daily oil consumption, missing repeatedly. And the world is trying to patch that hole with emergency barrels, spare capacity, rerouting, and hope. Hope is not a source of energy. That is why I keep focusing on the reserve math. If the whole world is trying to replace a massive daily shortfall with a few million barrels of spare capacity here, a strategic release there, a rerouted cargo elsewhere, then the natural question is not whether patchwork exists. The natural question is how long the patchwork holds. That is the adult question. And the answer, at least in the logic presented by the source document, is not very long. That is why mid to late April matters in the framework. not because dates are magical, because buffers are finite. And once finite buffers are consumed, every remaining barrel becomes more important. That is when prices stop being polite. Now, let us talk geography, because oil shocks do not hit evenly. Asia goes first because Asia is deeply exposed to Persian Gulf flows. Africa gets stressed fast because the margin of safety is thinner. Australia feels it through shipment timing and reserve pressure. Europe begins moving into demand reduction language, because that is what governments do when supply is no longer reliable enough to support normal assumptions. Then the United States, lulled by distance, energy mythology, and the comfort of still seeing the app work, starts realizing its own buffer is gone. That is the order. Again, not because America is weak. Because logistics obey geography and timing more than patriotism, and that is why I reject the lazy reassurance that the U.S. will be last, so it will be fine. Last is not fine. Last only means later, and later is how many Americans prefer to experience bad news, because it lets them imagine the country is above the problem until the bill finally reaches the household. That is a very expensive habit. Now let me turn to the stock market, because this is where the disconnect becomes almost absurd. The market is still behaving as though a smooth resolution remains the base case. Fine markets can behave stupidly for a while. They have done it before. What matters more is the internal contradiction. Main Street sentiment is deeply strained. The University of Michigan consumer sentiment data is not describing a population bursting with economic confidence. Meanwhile, the broad equity market floats near highs as though the world still deserves a low-friction future. Those two things do not usually remain separated forever. At some point, one line has to move toward the other. And history teaches a very simple lesson here. The man filling up the tank, paying the grocery bill, renewing insurance, noticing that daily life feels worse, is usually not the one living in fantasy. It is often the market that is slow, not because markets are always dumb, because markets can stay focused on the wrong variables for longer than uncomfortable people expect. That is especially true when the paper price of the key physical input is still being held down psychologically, while the real-world cost structure is already deteriorating. That is what makes this moment so dangerous. The market is not yet pricing a world where the physical system wins decisively. It is pricing a world where narrative still has room, and that is where the biggest repricings are born. Now let us go to history, because history is not a prophecy machine, but it is a very good way to punish intellectual laziness. People love saying that the past is not guaranteed to repeat. Fine, of course not. What they usually mean is that they do not want to do the harder work of studying structural analogies. The 1973 oil shock took around 7% of global supply offline. That alone produced an extraordinary market and inflation response. The 1990 Gulf War shock, again around 7%, still produced a meaningful drawdown, even though the resolution came faster and cleaner than feared. Now, look at the present setup described in the source material. The supply disruption is not smaller, it is larger, potentially much larger, and the market is still acting as though the path ahead should look smooth enough to justify near-recordy pricing. That is not a small disagreement. That is a giant pricing wager. And when giant pricing wagers collide with physical shortages, they often lose quickly. This is why I care so much less about whether someone can give me the perfect oil target, and much more about whether the economy can digest a prolonged supply emergency at current valuations. I do not think it can, not cleanly. And certainly not without more inflation, which brings me to food. This is where people who are still trying to treat the issue as just gasoline reveal that they do not understand the economy. Oil is not just fuel. Oil is movement. Oil is fertilizer. Oil is plastic. Oil is shipping. Oil is refrigeration. Oil is the hidden energy subsidy beneath grocery, store normality. And once natural gas and related energy inputs get disrupted, fertilizer prices begin moving. Then food follows later. That is exactly the type of delayed effect that gives governments false comfort early and households real pain later. The source material points to fertilizer prices already climbing back toward the levels seen during the 2022 food stress cycle. That matters enormously, because if fertilizer costs are rising now, then the food story is already forming for the second half of the year. Not because anyone wants it to, because energy shocks do not stop politely at the gas pump. They move into food with a lag. That lag is one of the cruelest features of the whole system, because it allows policymakers to say, look, the first shock is behind us. Just before the second shock arrives, that is exactly how households get trapped. First gas, then groceries. Then the broader sense that everything costs more while the official narrative still sounds strangely upbeat. Now let me bring in bonds, because this is where the entire story matures from unpleasant to dangerous. Oil shocks by themselves can hurt growth. Oil shocks in a heavily indebted system can hurt the financial architecture. That is a much more serious thing. If oil pushes inflation higher, then the Federal Reserve becomes more constrained. That is obvious. A central bank cannot confidently cut rates into a fresh inflationary wave without risking a new round of credibility damage. But if the Fed cannot cut or cannot cut enough, then long-duration financing conditions remain tighter than a debt-saturated government would like. That matters, because the U.S. is sitting on almost $40 trillion in debt. At that scale, every move in the 10-year yield matters, not abstractly. Directly, debt service gets more expensive. Deficits become harder to contain. Mortgage rates stay ugly. Corporate financing gets more painful. The whole economic machine becomes more rate sensitive. This is why I think the bond chart in the source material was one of the most important parts of the entire argument, because it is not only showing rising yields in the US, UK, Germany, and Japan, it is also showing something more unsettling. China's yields moving lower while the others move higher. That is a signal, not a complete verdict, but a signal. Capital in crisis is supposed to run automatically toward the old safe havens. When that pattern begins to look less automatic, you should pay attention. When the U.S. is carrying an enormous debt stack and rising yields threaten to turn the debt burden from loud to politically deafening, you should pay even closer attention. This is where the phrase death spiral begins to matter. If oil lifts inflation, the Fed cannot ease enough. If the Fed cannot ease, yields stay high. If yields stay high, debt service worsens. If debt service worsens, fiscal pressure rises. If fiscal pressure rises, confidence weakens. That is not a clean recession story. That is a debt management problem inside an energy shock. Very few combinations are more dangerous for a modern system than those two things landing together. Now, let me address the question hovering behind all of this. Why would anyone allow the paper oil market to keep projecting calm if the physical world is telling a different story? Because narrative buys time, that is the answer. If you can sell paper at lower prices, if you can lean on sentiment, if you can whisper, the route is open often enough, if you can manage the headline long enough for certain players to exit or reposition, then you can keep markets calmer than the physical world deserves for a while. That does not mean the system is omnipotent. It means financial theater can be very useful before expiration day. The source material hints at a short positioning and short squeeze logic here. The idea that paper oil can be leaned on right up until physical delivery pressures become impossible to finesse. I am not going to pretend I can prove every actor behind that. What I will say is that the pattern itself fits an old market truth. Paper can suppress physical reality briefly. It cannot defeat it permanently. That is the key. If you sell promises of oil, you do not actually want to deliver into a world where real buyers increasingly need physical barrels. Then eventually the paper side must either buy back, reprice, or break. That is how squeezes happen. Not because the internet became dramatic, because physical reality finally demanded a settlement the screen had been postponing. Now let me say something important about preparing, because preparation is where most people either become children or adults. The child asks, should I panic? The adult asks, what assumptions in my life stop working if the physical world is right and the paper world is wrong? That is the better question. What assumptions stop working? That gasoline stays roughly manageable. that food inflation stays mild, that the market stays near highs because the future is still smooth, that the Fed has generous room, that bonds can be funded without strain, that the debt burden can keep rising without rate consequences. If the physical world is right, then many of those assumptions begin failing in sequence. That does not mean civilization ends. It means life gets more expensive, portfolios get more fragile, and the people who mistook narrative for structure get punished. That is serious enough. Now, I want to be honest. I do not know the exact day the gas station becomes the scene of recognition. I do not know the exact week the grocery bill becomes the political signal. I do not know the exact session when the equity market stops caring about the optimistic script and starts repricing the actual terms of energy, inflation, and debt. No one knows those timestamps honestly, but I do not need the exact date to understand the direction. That is the advantage of thinking structurally instead of theatrically. If the spread between paper and physical oil remains extreme, that matters. If the buffer is gone, that matters. If fertilizer is climbing, that matters. If the bond market is straining, that matters. If consumer sentiment is already weak while equity prices remain elevated, that matters. If historical analogs suggest the current supply shock is not small, that matters. You do not need a prophecy when you already have enough stress lines crossing the same point. That is the whole case. The source material used the interstellar wave metaphor, and I think it was useful because it captures exactly the danger of delayed recognition. You think you are seeing mountains. You think the landscape is stable enough to read calmly. But what you are actually seeing is the front edge of a moving force whose size you have badly misjudged because your mind prefers stillness to motion and prefers narrative to physics. That is what the market is doing now. It is reading the wave as scenery. The physical world reads it correctly. That is why I trust the physical world more. Now let me end where I think every serious investor should end, not with certainty, with hierarchy. When paper and physical reality diverge, trust the physical world. When inventories and flows tighten, trust the actual supply chain more than the television panel. When fertilizer rises after an energy shock, trust the grocery bill will eventually care. When consumer sentiment and the stock market diverge badly, trust that one of them will move, and it will probably not be the household suddenly deciding life was fine all along. When debt-heavy sovereigns face higher yields into an energy-driven inflation wave, trust that the financing problem is more serious than the official tone suggests. That is the hierarchy, not a prediction machine. A hierarchy of trust. And at the top of that hierarchy sits one principle I have learned again and again. You can manipulate a screen, you can massage a narrative, you can delay recognition, you cannot print physical atoms, you cannot fake delivered oil forever. You cannot talk a fertilizer plant into ignoring feedstock costs. You cannot will a debt spiral into politeness once the rates and the inflation stop cooperating. That is why this matters. Not because I need to sound dramatic, because the physical world is already telling a harsher truth than the market wants to hear. And if history means anything, it is that the physical world eventually gets the final word. It always has. It probably will again. And when it does, the people who dismiss the oil shock as just another noisy headline are going to discover that it was never just about oil. It was about the whole system that oil was quietly holding up. That is what is about to hit America, not merely higher prices at the pump. A delayed recognition event, and those events, once they arrive, tend to move much faster than the people waiting for certainty ever expect.